Hey E314 peeps, this is your instructor, Eileen McGinnis. I've created this podcast to give you a bit of a theoretical framework for our all-too-brief final unit on literature and medicine. Specifically, I will be summarizing two important monographs by the influential essayist, critic, and novelist Susan Sontag. Illness as Metaphor, which she wrote while herself a cancer patient in the late 1970s, and AIDS and Its Metaphors, written a decade later, which extends her arguments to the AIDS epidemic that had been identified only 7 years earlier. Sontag's premise is basically this. Despite, or perhaps because of, the progress of modern medicine, when we encounter an illness that we don't fully understand and that we can't successfully manage or cure, it becomes imbued with an aura of mystery, of vague dread. We begin to stigmatize modern diseases through mythical narratives and cultural metaphors. Cancer, for example, has been portrayed as a ruthless secret invasion, an evil, invincible predator, and, due to its insatiable growth, a demonic pregnancy. Sontag wants us to be more aware of these metaphors because, as she argues, they have real-world implications. So what does Sontag mean by metaphor? At the beginning of AIDS and Its Metaphors, she offers this definition from Aristotle. Metaphor consists in giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. Sontag acknowledges that one cannot think without metaphors, but she also insists that there are some metaphors that we should consciously avoid. In her discussion of modern diseases like tuberculosis, cancer, and HIV/AIDS, Sontag points to the pervasive use of military metaphors, of a language of warfare, which is also reflected in these images on screen. We talk, for example, of a patient's body being under attack, and of a search for a cure to conquer cancer. Cancer cells do not simply multiply, they invade and colonize. Sontag points out that the military metaphor first came into use in the 1880s with the identification of bacteria as agents of disease. On the one hand, one would think that this portrait of disease as a menacing invader would not stigmatize the patient, who is merely an innocent victim, unable to defend himself against the intruder. However, Sontag intriguingly notes in AIDS and Its Metaphors that often a disease's negative associations can affect a patient's self-perception. She writes, 12 years ago, when I became a cancer patient, what particularly enraged me was seeing how much the very reputation of this illness added to the suffering of those who have it. Many fellow patients with whom I talked during my initial hospitalizations evinced disgust at their disease and a kind of shame. A closely related metaphor has, as Sontag notes, a science-fictional tinge. The metaphor of disease as an alien invasion, of mutant others attacking the self. For instance, immunologists describe cancer cells as non-self. And in a 1986 issue of Time magazine, the authors explain that in an AIDS patient, the host cell is, quote, overcome by its alien product. Sontag gives the example of syphilis, which swept through Europe in the late 15th century, as an illustration of the need to peg a disease as foreign, as coming from outside the community. Syphilis was the French pox to the British, morbus Germanicus to the Parisians, the Naples sickness to the Florentines, and the Chinese sickness to the Japanese. Sontag continues, but what may seem like a joke about the inevitability of chauvinism reveals a more important truth, that there is a link between imagining disease and imagining foreignness. It lies perhaps in the very concept of wrong, which is archaically identical with the non-us, the alien. These related metaphors of invasion and foreignness point to the connection in our cultural imagination between the body and the body politic. Epidemics have historically been read as moral judgments on a community, and, quote, illnesses have always been used as metaphors to enliven charges that a society was corrupt or unjust. For instance, here's John Adams writing in his journal only a few years before the American Revolution, quote, the body of the people seems to be worn out by struggling, and venality, servility, and prostitution eat and spread like a cancer. Thus, metaphors about disease cut both ways. Not only do military and nationalistic metaphors affect our perceptions of disease, but the language of disease is often used to discuss political and social issues. While the metaphors we use and the stories we tell about diseases change over time, Sontag nonetheless encourages us to be reflective and self-aware as new diseases emerge. Here's Sontag's conclusion to AIDS and its metaphors. We are not being invaded. The body is not a battlefield. The ill are neither unavoidable casualties nor the enemy. We, medicine, society, are not authorized to fight back by any means whatever. For me, Sontag's work points to the importance of art and criticism in both calling attention to and transforming the stories we tell and the metaphors we use about disease. I'll conclude by talking through a couple of provocative contemporary examples that challenge stereotyped images of disease. Like Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos, Luce Jerram's virology art calls our attention to the survival skills of microorganisms. His sculptures of notoriously deadly microbes comment on scientific objectivity, calling attention to how specialists' conventions determine the perceived accuracy of an image. By foregrounding the natural transparency of microbes, the glass sculptures underscore the limits of scientific vision. As Seed magazine explains, microbes, such as bacteria, protists, and viruses, aren't the brightly colorful creatures often seen in journals and newspapers. EM images and technical renderings are typically colored by scientists, either to mark processes or simply for aesthetic reasons. Most viruses are also at the edge of our microscope's capabilities of perception, so visualizing them is a balancing act that involves an element of speculation. As Jerram notes, quote, "We're imposing our culture on scientific data, whether we like it or not." Is there a kind of species portrayal going on when deadly microscopic killers are displayed like rare jewels? What does it mean to experience a sense of awe when confronted with the beautiful form of the smallpox virus, which killed an estimated 500 million human beings in the 20th century? There's a suggestion here that our depictions of nature are colored by human values and human fears. In response, Jerram's virology art offers this challenge. Is it possible to find beauty in what can kill us? In another series, artist Laura Kallman photographs models wearing jewelry arranged to mimic the skin infections, rashes, and sores that manifest underlying medical conditions. The temporariness of the jeweled piercings, which are gold acupuncture needles adorned with semi-precious stones, mirrors the fleeting surface visibility of long-dormant diseases like syphilis. At the same time, the relative permanence of these materials underscores our bodily impermanence. Furthermore, is there something quote-unquote sick about female consumption and body modification in the service of ideal beauty? Why are these photos jarring? How do they subvert the binaries of health versus disease, nature versus culture? And while unsettling, are these images also beautiful? If so, I wonder if that's because, while they undercut viewers' expectations, the female model is still white, young, and healthy, and thus conforms to certain conventional representations of women that we see in magazines and advertising. In conclusion, both Sontag's theory and these examples from contemporary art give us some questions to think about as we approach the reading for this unit. They ask us to be aware of the power relations and fears about outsiders that are embedded in the stories we tell about disease. We've also seen how the storytelling impulse extends to conversations about medicine, anatomy, and health. Even scientific illustrations make choices based on larger cultural narratives.